My name is Ben. I grew up on a farm in rural North Florida surrounded by friends and family who today support Trump. While I personally see his leadership as deeply concerning, I also believe we've become so polarized that we've lost sight of the bigger issue, the growing economic divide that affects all of us, no matter our political beliefs. In this podcast, I sit down with Trump supporters to have an honest discussion seeking not to debate, but to understand. Join me as we look for common ground that can unite us all in the fight for economic injustice. Jay Finlayson is a friend of mine from my small farming town in rural North Florida. I invited him to talk with me so that I could understand more his views and why he voted for Trump. I asked Jay to introduce himself.
I am technically a registered Republican. I probably would consider myself a little bit more libertarian. I would not really consider myself a stereotypical Trump supporter for a variety of reasons. I have voted a little bit more across party lines than most people do in 2025. I have shown Donald Trump at least the support of a vote in the most recent cycle.
Okay, so clearly Jay isn't hardcore MAGA, but he still voted for Trump, and I wanted to know why.
It's a great question. In 2020, I made the decision not to vote for Trump. In 2020, I was much more worried about that because of some of the things that he was talking about with potentially trying to remove term limits. I've spent a little bit of time in Nicaragua where they went down that road. Right now, they've had the same president for the last 40 years, and all of his opposition mysteriously dies right before the election. And it just really concerned me that might be setting us up on a different trajectory. When it was President Biden, who historically has been viewed as a little bit more moderate than Kamala Harris was viewed, I was really going back and forth with it a lot. Then for me personally, when the first assassination attempt happened and I saw how President Trump responded, for me, that actually was the big shift that made me start to think I might actually be able to vote for this guy.
This isn't the first time that I've heard Donald Trump's assassination attempt was a pivotal moment in a Trump voters' decision-making process. And so I asked Jay to explain more about what changed his mind.
When he was giving a speech at the RNC, I felt like he displayed humility that I had never seen from the guy before. He consistently gave credit to everybody else on his team, and as you know, the man loves nothing more than to take credit, especially for somebody else's hard work, and that was pretty motivating for me, but also because of the ways that he seemed to value life a little bit differently than I had seen him do before, right? He kind of comes across with this air sometimes of invincibility. You can't touch me, even though you're all out to get me. I'm going to come out on top in the end. And it seemed that had been taken away. For me, that was really what started to shift it for me. This was the first time I had ever seen him look like a candidate that I might be able to have a little bit of confidence in voting for. Unfortunately, he did start to go back towards some of his classic tendencies as the cycle continued forward, and then seeing kind of the fallout there in the wake with how the DNC unfolded.
So this is the first time Jay starts to talk about his impressions of the other side, the Democrats. And what really stuck with him was how undemocratic the process of replacing Joe Biden with Kamala Harris without a primary vote and potentially hiding cognitive decline in Joe Biden.
Yeah, that really took away a lot of confidence for me in the Democratic Party.
What I remember from the time post-assassination was a clear increased call to unity. And I remarked to Jay that call to unity seems to have evaporated, and that Trump seems to instead have decided that he prefers to do things unilaterally rather than even through Congress, which he controls.
Yes, no, I would generally agree with that on both fronts. I do think that it is fair to say that his rhetoric was that of moving towards unity. Going all the way back to 2016, my official stance on Trump in 2016 was, looking at his first 100 days in office, I like almost nothing the man says, but I like a good amount of what he does. And, he's a piece of work. He's our president, right? So I don't intend to be disrespectful, but I think that's a pretty consensus opinion.
Well, all right, so let me see. So you've got a president who you weren't sure about, but then he showed some humility, and the Democrats clearly messed that up by I mean, it even appears to me that at least leadership in the Democratic Party were hiding Joe Biden's cognitive
Right.
decline and
Right.
didn't have a primary. And most Democrats, I think, would agree with a lot of what I'm saying. I mean, people I talk to would be like, yeah, we didn't like Joe Biden that much anyway, but we saw in Joe Biden and in Kamala Harris not potentially the end of democracy. And I mean, like, there's more to it than that, of course. Sure, more policies that we would agree on. But you had like some fear that Trump might try to end term limits even the first time. The second time around, we had Project 2025, which I don't know what you know about it, but at the very outset, it appeared to be a manual for how to cement one party's control over the government.
Yeah, and I looked into that a little bit, and from what I found, he was trying to consistently distance himself from it.
He did verbally try to distance himself from it, although J.D. Vance appears to have been rather involved in the creation of that, and they seem to be executing quite a bit of the playbook that was in 2025. To be honest, I'm not an expert, so I can't sure quote from what 2025 he has implemented. But I guess what I would say is that there were still some concerns, but you still felt like, on a whole, you could maybe just trust him more, or we've sort of talked about the things that led you to not want to vote for him and the ways that you kind of overcame it. But what were the positives to voting for Trump in your mind?
Yeah, so when we think about the idea of the end of democracy, and I look at how the Democratic Party handled all of their stuff, where it was utterly void of democratic process from what we can see in the public eye, that's not going to instill a great deal of confidence in me that these are the people to carry forward democracy when they didn't give their own party a chance to cast a vote on who their candidate should be.
Okay, fair enough. So you felt like, on the whole, the democracy question was a toss-up on it.
Yes.
It was at this point that I should have followed up and continued to ask Jay why he voted for Trump besides the democracy question. We didn't get to that, but maybe we'll have him on again and try. How do you feel about that now? Have you been following what Trump has been doing?
A little bit of it. A little bit of it. I've followed it enough to know that I don't have time to follow it. He's been so active.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of their strategy. The Steve Bannon was one of his advisors and has been quoted as saying, you have to overwhelm the press by going so fast and moving at muzzle velocity that no one can keep up, and then you can get all of your stuff done. So it is part of their strategy to overwhelm, in their theory, the opposition, but it does overwhelm everyone who's trying to pay
Yes,
attention.
yes. Oh man, I'm far from a political science scholar, right? This is I don't even know that I could classify this as a hobby interest of mine. But I do try to stay at least a little bit informed of what's going on since I am casting a vote, right? This is a weighty thing, and so I feel like I need to have at least a little bit of an idea of what's going on. And right now I can't really keep up. Especially because it's so difficult with quote unquote news sources that really rely on clicks. And so they'll put out a title and I'll read the article and I'll look into something a little bit more. And it's like, well, that's not even what was actually said. You've pulled this one thing out of a much larger speech. And so now I'm beginning to lose trust for your work as a whole.
This is something we didn't really talk more about on recording, but we did talk about it afterward. The problem with the right and Trump's strategy is that they wish to sow distrust in all media as a whole, by repeating that you can't trust media and showing some examples of why. But ultimately, media is made up of a lot. It's made up of social media, and it's also made up of tons of print and video media, audio, podcasts. It's really discouraging when you see something posted online that turns out to be fake or misleading, and it allows you to disregard all of media. But this, in my view, is a mistake, because there are trustworthy sources out there, and those trustworthy sources aren't likely to be the government themselves or the president or a presidential candidate. So if you allow yourself to buy into this line that you can't trust any of the media, then you're left to either trust no one and make uninformed decisions, or to only trust the candidate himself, which is very dangerous. If you, like Jay, are struggling to figure out how to keep up and who to trust, I recommend ground.news. It's a good website that will show you different perspectives.
And so it's been a real challenge for me in particular trying to navigate some of that stuff. I've looked a little bit at some of the things that they've been saying Doge has found. How do we know if any of the things they're telling us are true?
I think you have a lot more skepticism than what I've seen from sort of comments of Trump. And then, you can't gauge the average Trump supporter by their comments on social media, because those are the people who are a little more impassioned, let's say. But
Right.
You generally have either the left saying, well, they're lying about all of that, probably, and then the right saying, look at all the good things that they're doing, or thank God my money isn't going to this thing.
Sesame Street in Iran or whatever it was.
I don't know how you feel about Elon Musk and his role, but I think we can safely say from what we've seen that Elon Musk is making calls such as, and I'd be interested in your particular views on USAID because you've been abroad and you've seen third world countries that USAID is intended to help. USAID, for those of you who don't know, is the federal agency that is most responsible for sending foreign money abroad to provide aid to third world countries and those in need.
Yeah, right. One of the things that I saw, if I remember correctly, it was President Trump reading off a list in a press conference, and he mentioned multiple countries that I personally have done humanitarian sort of work in. I was like, oh man, they really need that money.
Well, so what appears to have happened is that Elon Musk has decided that USAID is corrupt and needs to go away. And so they did that. And at the very least, it appears to be outside of even the president's ability to do that, to dismantle an agency that was created by Congress. And their strategy is do it, create a lunch of chaos, fire everyone, tell them they're fired, and then let them sue. And maybe it'll get blocked in court. But at the very least, they're hoping to create some chaos there. We have sort of one mostly unelected man deciding that an entire agency should disappear within a month and then doing it. And the other industry that I would point to is CFPB, which is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. It was established after 2008. The financial crisis, to basically stop things like that from happening, to stop banks from giving subprime mortgages, and they've been fairly successful. And he said, well, it's a corrupt organization and we're going to get rid of it. And in theory, it's gone, still being litigated in the courts. So when I look at that, for sure there's some waste. It's a huge organization. The government's not perfect. And there's probably some corruption. It's a huge organization and people aren't perfect. There's two ways to do that. Well, in theory, there's only one way to do that, which is to make a proposal to Congress, put things out in the light, and then legislate on changes. And then they've decided that they don't need to do that, and they're just going to kind of fight it out.
In some sense, I'll say it's unsurprising. In 16, I compared Trump to Teddy Roosevelt, and I feel like this whole model of operation mirrors that in some significant ways. Right, Teddy being famously on record as saying, while Congress debates, the Panama Canal goes forward. And that's very much the approach that Trump has seemed to take, and I would argue has taken previously as well. So in that sense, it doesn't really surprise me necessarily. In terms of the original question of Musk and his newfound powers, I generally, in some sense, almost assume the worst in people. And so I don't have a great deal of trust for that sort of stuff. Like, if we can believe what they're telling us. I don't trust people that I think have an agenda that much. I think he does have an agenda. The tricky thing for me with a lot of the cuts that they're doing is I don't know how far he can actually go. And so depending on how far he can go, I would be really nervous.
I would imagine he could go fairly far, and this depends on what you mean. One angle of how far he can go is, can he actually officially dismantle the agencies? And I would argue that that question is almost moot, except that it's not. But
Right.
let's.
I would have said certainly not until
Yeah,
they started talking about it.
I think that he would likely lose in court, at least on some of these things. And then whether he or not he would respect the court's opinion is something we should talk about because he's publicly said that he might not. Let's just start by assuming that he can, but he can still do quite a bit of damage in the meantime. Murky legal damage by just not paying for a while. And that's going to cause people to quit. It's going to cause people to die. Bill Gates has said millions will probably die from USAID not doing the work that it does. But he also has been criticized for having his own people, some 25-year-olds who go by names like Big Balls online, getting direct access to the computer systems. And it's unclear what things he could do there. He could theoretically install a back door into the computer systems. And I don't know who would stop him. If he has the president's leave to go in and do what he wants, I'm not sure that anyone is paying attention. And it's not clear to me that they needed to do it this way. They have a majority in all of the houses. They could have done this the right way. And
that's the thing that I think is an interesting point, right? If you have the majority and if you believe that they will hold to the party line, which in recent years, both parties have shown they will, with very few exceptions on either side, then you can do it the quote unquote right way.
Yeah. So I think we're getting at, do we trust Elon Musk or not? And I feel like you don't necessarily. You would say you probably don't trust Elon Musk to just make these
I'm
decisions.
sure you're familiar with the phrase that absolute power corrupts absolutely. I generally think that power corrupts. We have people who are really flawed running the system. And so when I think about a Musk or a Trump for that matter, it's not a surprise for me to see them test how far they can go before they really get smacked. But with Musk in particular, yeah, it makes me a little bit nervous how much access he's been given. Now, the flip side is I do think that we needed to do a lot of work on moving towards a more balanced budget, right? This is obviously a huge issue. I do tend to agree with you that I would prefer to see them work through this in Congress. I also recognize that Elon is doing a lot of stuff that would never get done in Congress, to say the least.
Why do you think it'd never get done in Congress? Like, what's an example, maybe, or a theoretical example that couldn't get done in Congress?
So my point in saying that is simply that our country is founded on compromise. And so to make sweeping cuts like he's alleging to do wouldn't fly in Congress, I don't think.
There'd be a reason that it doesn't fly in Congress, which is that a congressman thought it'd be bad for their position, theoretically, because it would be bad for their constituents.
Right, which is a tricky thing too, because there is such a presence from lobbyists too that are in the game, right?
So, I mean, I think that this is where we get to some fairly common ground and where I think we've been artificially divided by, I mean, I would put a lot of the blame on sort of Republican narratives, but the Democrats are to blame here as well. Most people would agree that money doesn't have a place in politics and
Right.
the Citizens United decision should be overturned. And like, it's never happened because there's not been a focus on it, because we've been distracted by immigrants, because we've been distracted by even government waste. I should also give a mention to identity politics and wokeism as a distraction. Is it our top tier problem, or is our top tier problem equalizing the class system in the United States and reducing the voice of money in politics? So I guess what I would say is that I agree with you that lobbyists are a problem, but what you're basically saying is that you don't trust Congress to make the right decisions because money corrupts.
Yep, that is certainly a part of it.
But the alternative to that doesn't seem to me that it's, well, the richest man in the world, therefore, should make changes to a lot of these agencies had open investigations into Musk companies that he clearly has a conflict of interest. And when asked about it, the president said, if there's a conflict, we won't let him anywhere near it. Hasn't happened.
Elon had said something about he was out to destroy the liberal ideology or something like that,
Yeah.
which his first choice being USAID would seem pretty indicative of what I would consider a clear agenda.
It should almost be certainly true that Elon has done something that wouldn't have been done had it been done.
That was a good
proper
thing.
way. Yeah. So then the question is, what in there is good? And there probably is something. It's hard to say, right? We kind of can't point to it.
Yeah, and it's a difficult thing for me too when I think about, as a taxpayer, right? When I think about how much money we've been sending to help solve problems around the world that we are far from having solved here at home. And that can be a tricky thing for me, right? Again, I feel it much more tangibly at other places around the world than most people do. We're sending money to do work in countries that I'm assuming is being filtered likely through their government in some capacity that's just outright corrupt.
One of the things that I think I see is there's clearly a financial economic problem in the United States.
Huge.
And the Democrats handle it very poorly by saying, like, look, the economy is doing great, because they were looking at metrics like GDP growth, and those things were doing great. The problem with those metrics is that they don't translate to civilian standard of living. They translate mostly to capitalist shareholder ownership, shareholder value, class problems, top 1% growing the pie more than the lower classes. I can agree that the Democrats' messaging was wrong. But when we sort of look at policies, you sort of see a Democratic slate of policies that try to push towards single-payer healthcare systems and like increasing the access of healthcare. Obamacare, for example, was sort of a push in that direction that, in my opinion, didn't go far enough. Bernie Sanders is all about giving healthcare to the people. He's a Democrat. Like, I think that he would disagree with the Democrat on a lot of their party line policies,
Right.
but he's professed a Democrat and believes he aligns with them more. So I think that we kind of want a little more from our government. I think we're basically saying the government isn't giving us enough value. And the conservative approach to it is, well, then the government should have less money and be smaller and people should get more money. And the Democrat approach to it, well, the government should be doing more for the people and like trying to solve these problems.
So for me in particular, I actually don't feel like the government should be doing more for me. Yeah, I don't feel like it's the government's responsibility as a whole to do things for me that I can do for myself.
Things like healthcare access, for example, by which I mean you can do it for yourself, but you have to pay for it. You have to get transportation. You have to take time off work. You don't feel that that should be something the government should help people obtain.
I think help people obtain, sure, but as like a universal mandate, that's where I start to pause.
I mean, let's just agree with that. So we think the government should be doing more to provide healthcare for
And
people.
well, and so right, if we're going for like my kind of perfect worldviews in some sense, for me, Jay Finlayson, I fundamentally would love to see the church step up and do a lot of that stuff.
Do you think that's practical? Like, how does the church step up and do that?
I mean, they've done it before.
You mean the Catholic Church?
No, no, I mean the early church. So, right, so in an ideal world, if you have people who think that this money that I'm making is not actually mine, it's God's, right? God's gifted me with these abilities and that sort of thing. And God, who is very different from Trump and Elon, and cares.
You said it. I mean,
Fair enough. Yeah, if anybody wants to debate me on that, reach out to Ben. You can have my phone number. I'd be happy to talk with you about how I think God differs from Elon and Trump. Right. God very clearly cares about people. And so if we are a people who's going to care about people, then, to use me as an example in some sense here, right? I have given significant money, time, and effort to trying to help others, right? I have personally taken people to the doctor. I have personally gone and handed out food to people who are having a hard time making ends meet and getting food for themselves. I've taken people to go to different meetings and appointments to be able to try to qualify for this thing or for this job. I've helped people try to find jobs, those sorts of things. The list goes on and on. I'm not trying to say, oh, I'm a phenomenal person or whatever. But
you're just saying there are things that we could do to help.
yes, and in particular the church, right? And I personally get really frustrated because there's a lot of people running around saying, I'm a Christian, I'm a Christian, I'm a Christian. I can't vote for this because of this one thing, who then never do anything else to live that out in a way that makes a difference. And to me, it's honestly a little bit disgusting. In my ideal world, people who claim the title of Christian in America is nearly 100 million, depending on which numbers you look at. That's most of the way to a third of the country. Man, if every single one of them wanted to put their money where their mouth is, I think it could have a huge impact in our opportunity to meet some of those needs for people at a large scale.
What in your mind is the difference between people donating to the church and the church stepping up, and people being taxed by the government and the government stepping up?
Well, so for me, when I'm talking about the church, I'm not actually talking about an organization. So I'm not talking about you give to this 501c3 that's registered and that sort of stuff. I'm talking about, for me, the church is actually people, right?
300.
Yeah, in a sense. Yep. And so when I'm talking about the church, I'm actually talking primarily about people who call themselves believers. But I am speaking primarily about individuals who would actually choose to live the way that they say they would.
I'm still sort of interested in what the practical difference is. Like, as an idealistic sort of desire, I think I acknowledge that and I respect that. In the world that we live in, I wonder what the difference is between sort of that idealized world and the government providing that in that way, in the sense that are government healthcare workers who are paid through taxes, which are essentially people chipping in for each other's healthcare. Where does the line stop making sense for you, that the government could provide that as a service for the people, especially if the government exists to create a stable and enjoyable environment for its citizens?
It's a good question. I'd have to think about that more. In my ideal world, there are a lot of government functions that I think the church actually being the thing that it's supposed to be would reduce the need for. And so I would have to think more because we're so far from that being true. I spend so much time trying to live in a way that shows a critique of a good thing by trying to point to a more beautiful way. Because I'm so far from actually getting to that point, I would have to stop and think about the logistical side that you're asking about.
Your side sort of relies on people to do good,
Mhm.
which is a good ideal to strive for. I think that my view of history tells us that relying on that certainly can work out. Like, there certainly are strong communities where people do good. But it appears to me in history that the way these things actually get solved are through collective institutions. That in the beginning of time, you have a tribal leader who is asserting his will on people. And as you sort of move towards a king in a feudal hierarchy, then you have institutions that start to pop up. that can sort of limit that power and actually expose the voice of the people a little more and give them some way of pushing back. Because you got peasants, they have no way of pushing back.
Right.
They can take their pitchforks and they can stab at the people in the armor. The people in the armor are getting paid to stop the peasants, and they're probably going to do that. So you have the Magna Carta being signed, where the dukes start to take more power from the kings and they have more control. And in theory, this is a better thing because now the king can't on a whim change his mind about who gets healthcare and whether we should spend money on healthcare or not, or whether we should all send people to go fight France because his little brother pissed him off.
Sure.
Institutions get a little better. The Catholic Church was a pretty strong and powerful institution that I think did a lot of good in the world for a while, in certain forms and in certain places.
Yes, yeah. They certainly have fumbled in some key ways, to say the least.
And then we have further democracies, constitutional monarchies and democracies, which start to invent more institutions. And law is an institution that starts to hold people accountable and sort of enforces this order on the world. And in general, we've seen huge benefits from these things. Institutions, more than anything else, good quality institutions. And when I say institutions, I also mean things like federal agencies. They are institutions, are one of the most important things to sort of a prosperous people. They provide predictability, ensure that people act in these ordered ways that you're sort of saying, I wish they would act in these ordered ways. And institutions are how you get that. Like you pay people and you set up rules and you set up hierarchies and you set up checks and balances. And so like what I see Trump doing is sort of the exact opposite of what it feels like needs to be done to create a world where we have that order and we have that support codified.
You look at all the things that Trump is doing right now, and you see that as antithetical to this greater good going forward.
Yeah, I mean, take the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Again, it was established to prevent banks from doing predatory things that caused the 2008 financial crisis, and he wants to get rid of it. Is it perfect? Probably not, but it was established from institutional learning. Like we saw a problem and we created a solution for that problem. Destroying the institution that attempted to solve that problem in society does nothing but revert us to having that problem in society. I could make similar arguments for things like healthcare and like this broader things. Like we probably would need more institutions for healthcare. I don't know what that is. It could be regulation on insurance providers. It could be single payer systems. It could be subsidies. But those things tend to be in history what makes society better and sustainable.
Yeah, I'm certainly not an anarchist. And so I don't actually know all of the things that are wrapped up into every agency and every bill that goes forward, that sort of stuff, right? But from a lot of things that I do know, I think that a lot of our systems and agencies are in need of major reform.
I don't think that anyone on the Democratic side would disagree with that statement, truly.
Yeah, so to be completely honest, I think that ironically, being that the Republican Party runs around saying we're the little government guys, not so self-evidently true when you look at Republican Congresses and presidencies, especially if you zoom out a little bit. If I'm honest, in my heart of hearts, I've gotten frustrated by things not happening repeatedly with this sort of gridlock that we have where, man, maybe for 2 years, the balance swings just enough for one side to start pushing in the direction that they want to push, only to 2 years later have it swing back to a gridlock, and then 2 years after that, the other side swings a few more seats and it goes, and they can make a few pushes in their direction, and then it's gridlocked, and so there's a sense in which, if in my heart of hearts, I get frustrated that it feels like nothing is being done. I don't think that justifies borderline anarchy in some sense.
Authoritarianism, I would say, more. I mean, it's not anarchy. People are making a decision. It's just two people that are making all of the decisions.
Which doesn't feel so much better to me.
It doesn't feel better to me either. It feels worse. And tying this into my institutional arguments, one of the institutions that we as society, as humanity, has sort of determined necessary are checks and balances on power.
Right.
And
that was actually one of the, for me, that actually played a part in me voting for Trump was trusting that we do have enough checks and balances to keep him from his worst self.
The basic principles of checks and balances, I think most people know. We have three branches of government. We have the judicial, which is meant to interpret the law, and then we have the Congress, which is meant to set the law, and then we have the executive, which is meant to execute the law, and they're meant to balance each other.
Right.
If we look at how Trump has been accomplishing what he's been accomplishing, he has been fairly flagrantly ignoring Congress. It is Congress's right to decide where money goes, power of the purse. pretty well established to be Congress's power, is Congress's power to establish agencies and destroy them. So then the question is, why isn't Congress acting as a check? And the simple answers that I would give is that they've chosen to abdicate their powers. They've said, we'll do what Trump wants us to do. And I think that's in part because he has huge popular support and they're scared of going against him and having him speak out against them. And I also think it's in part because Elon Musk has said publicly that he will spend $100 million to fund any challenger to anyone who obstructs Trump's agenda. So they've taken some rather strong steps to neuter Congress.
So yeah, I would agree on Congress abdicating power, and I would say that it actually started even prior to Trump, back when they started to take the art of compromise and set it to the side. Going back to what I was talking about a little bit ago about how for me, it's felt like, man, Congress hasn't actually gotten anything that significant done in a long time now. I agree with you that I do think that Congress has been abdicating power, and I do think that now the fear of Trump, I agree that there are also a lot of people in Congress who are operating in a way that is, for the obvious reasons, scared to buck him.
So from my perspective, Trump is leaning into this pretty hard. He's proud of
Oh,
that.
yeah, without a doubt.
And that worries me because he's being successful. And the reason I want to reach out to people is because the antidote to that is a crack in the popular support. Enough Trump voters reaching out to congressmen and saying, look, I voted for Trump, but that doesn't mean I want him to be a king.
Sure.
Sure. Okay,
Of
so
course.
I think we agree on that. Do you know that Trump has posted a lovely meme of him wearing a crown?
I'm not on social media, so I have a Facebook, but I rarely get on, so I do not see things
I
like
mean,
that.
look, Trump loves to troll libs, so
For sure.
we could call it trolling, but we could have a little discussion maybe about how I think he likes to see
There's
himself as a king.
so I'm the kind of guy that hears that and gets a little nervous.
Okay, so this picture of Trump wearing a crown with the phrase "Long live the king" was posted by the official White House account after he unilaterally rescinded previous rights from New York City to enable congestion pricing. I mean, the policy was not important. The message is a little more important. So he likes to see himself as a king, and we can debate all day how far he wants to take that and how much he was just trolling people, but we'll just put that there for you to look at for a minute, really take it in. That worries me a bit. And then you have the judicial branch, which we haven't talked about a lot yet. Now, it's clear he doesn't really have a lot of respect for law as written, and that he's happy to push as many boundaries as possible and ask forgiveness. And that doesn't necessarily bother me on its face. It does bother me how much destructive things he's doing with that. If he were to just do something and then wait for the law to slap him, that wouldn't bother me as much as him firing a bunch of people and upending their lives and then waiting for the law to tell him he shouldn't have done that, because you can't take that kind of step back. And it's not like he doesn't know that he doesn't have the power of the purse or the power to dismantle agencies. He's just sort of daring the courts to come after him. J.D. Vance has said before, I think he was even picked to become president. Obviously, I meant vice president. That if he would recommend Trump replace the federal bureaucracy with his own people, and if the courts tried to stop him, he should probably just say, the Supreme Court has made their ruling, now let them enforce it. In other words, what are they going to do about it?
Right.
And then Trump tweeted, I think he truthed it. He truthed
Yeah.
the phrase, no man who saves his country can violate the law.
Right. I did see something about that. Yeah. That made it on my YouTube feed.
So they're teasing us that they're not that interested in listening to the courts. So we have a man who has neutered Congress and who is daring the courts to come after them and is posting pictures of him in a crown. This makes me nervous. It makes me nervous.
Yes, I support him with a vote, but that's about the extent of it for me, right? I don't consider myself a Trump supporter ideologically at large. For where, in terms of like where it leaves us as a country, I do feel like I can speak a little bit more to that, because I do know so many people who are overtly Trump, right? Somebody that had kids that went to the same high school as both of us was one of the regional Trump reps in a past cycle. Right. And part of why I was willing to talk to you is because I also am really nervous about how divisive it's gotten. I know a lot of people who I would not be surprised, I'll say, I don't know that they would, but I would not be surprised if they would ostracize me politically, even for things I've said since we've been talking here. To be clear, I don't think I've said anything that's even, I've only been like even slightly moderate for the most part.
I think you've been completely reasonable.
Yeah, thank you. Right.
too.
I would say that I don't think I've really said much of anything that aligns super directly with liberal movements at large. I've said things that sympathize with them, I feel like, but I don't think I've said anything that's outright, oh man, we have to take all parameters off of how we think about abortion or any, right? Like, I'm not going so far as to say anything like that. Just saying, I think we should have some nuance in how we think about this. And I recognize it's harder for me to think about. And there are people who would ostracize me for saying that. It's somewhere in the middle in a lot of ways. It all makes me nervous. And there are a lot of people who feel like the country is effectively going to be saved because the election went to Trump.
I also heard a lot of maybe God saved him for a reason, and I don't want to comment on how true or not that is, but I think it leads to essentially a divine mandate, like a king would have claimed from before. If I've been sent by God to save the country, sure, he's not afraid to play that card.
Right. And man, I have a lot of friends that were going so far as to say, man, I think there's just going to be a lot of revival the next 4 years because Trump got elected.
Christian revival, you
Yes, sorry, I always forget sometimes that not everybody is in the same circles and use all the same buzzwords as I do. That there's, a lot of people saying there's gonna be widespread people who change their mind, change their direction, and choose to live more like Jesus than they did before because now Trump is the president. And I'm sitting over here saying, one, what's he gonna do? Somehow sign an executive order that everybody has to read the Bible this year? Like, what in the world is he gonna do?
He's going to establish the White House Faith Office with the televangelist in charge. He did that.
And oh my goodness, how could I have missed it?
You did? Do you miss it?
Yeah.
He put a televangelist in charge of the White House Faith Office, whose charter is to combat Christian, I don't know exactly the terms he used.
Pushback.
Bias.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Discrimination, something like that.
Right. It's a really tricky time because people, I really think identity politics is a really big part of why it's gotten so divisive. And to me, it really frustrates me to see so much of that going on because I think that if people were able to sit down and say, hey, here's the things that are important to me. What are the things that are important to you?
We would agree on a lot of things.
On a lot of things.
Yeah. I think generally people are being manipulated by the top classes, by billionaires, basically pitting us against each other, pointing out an enemy. That enemy can be immigration, but it also can be Democrats or it can even be Republicans. And in doing that, they seek to cement their own power and their own status. And Trump repeatedly says he wants to make America great again. And what it's clear that he means from that now is that he wants America to be like the Gilded Age, time of the robber barons. And by clear, I mean he's said as much. It's clear in his policies. Tariffs were central to American economic policies during the Gilded Age. Like, it's fairly clear to me. I could probably make a more expansive argument. But the Gilded Age was a time of extreme income inequality where the New York billionaires at the time, not billionaires, but the successor of that, the spiritual ancestor, were on top and everyone else, not so much. During that period, the wealthiest person was Rockefeller from New York. He had less than $2 billion, a far cry from the $400 billion that Musk has today. President McKinley was assassinated, and there was a massive labor unrest and financial crisis. This was not a good time for most Americans. It was a good time for people like Trump. This is fairly clearly, and I think to a lot of Democrats too, a class issue, an issue where someone like Elon Musk has a net worth that is something like 5 times all the cuts that he's already made. All these cuts that he's claiming, his personal net worth is 5 times that. That money could do a lot of good in the United States. Instead of cutting it from the millions of people overseas who are dying because we cut off USAID, we could have taxed Elon Musk. Would have been a pretty simple solution that they don't want us to talk about very much.
You mentioned Bill Gates earlier.
Yeah.
Does he pay significant taxes too?
Oh, I don't know what Bill Gates' tax burden is. I'm sure he takes as many loopholes as he can. He started the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, so he spends a lot on charity, but I don't know what his tax burden is.
It's just an interesting thing to me, using Elon as the poster child for the one who can offset that as opposed to
Why did I choose to use Elon Musk? Well, simply because he's the one who made the decision that U.S. energy was waste and where we should take the money.
fair enough.
Yeah. I mean, like, I would be of the opinion that we should tax billionaires a lot more than we're doing broad swath, and it should hit Bill Gates as well.
I think it's, and this is based on IRS data, I think it's 58% of the zip codes where the median income is over, it was like 100 or 150,000, are now Democratic strongholds.
Was that
And that's,
to you?
I don't know, but I'm curious to hear what you think about that, because the writer in that article was, and they also were showing the number of zip codes that are less than 75, 50, whatever, $1,000 that are now overwhelmingly Republican. And the article was trying to make the case that the Democratic Party is now actually shifted to be the party of the rich.
I would agree with the case in general that wealthy and educated voters tend to vote Democrat, and people with advanced degrees tend to be Democratic voters, and they tend to make more as well. I think I would make a couple of nuances. One would be that 100 and 150K is not anywhere near where I think I'm trying to focus our eye. Okay, it's like full class aristocracy versus like peasants. And so I don't know.
Right. There's a far cry from 150K to Elon.
Yeah, exactly. Or to, even 150K to like 500 million or a billion.
Even a million's
money, right?
Even a million is a big difference from 150K.
I think someone could get to a million if they were making 150K over their time and saving well. So, I mean, like, if your question is why do they shift Democrat, I think that it's probably very nuanced. And like, I imagine that education plays a role. Like, higher education means higher salary, and they tend to vote Democrat. We could talk about why. That could be interesting. But
yeah, I would be curious to hear your thoughts.
My thoughts are that the Democratic policies typically align with academic findings, climate change, even economic policies. The economic policies of tariffs and trickle-down economics, they're not very well substantiated by, I think, academic research at large. You can always find research to support your position, no matter what your position is. Like, it's hard for me to kind of distill my real thoughts here. I think that they have more time on their hands, wealthy people, that allows to think more about.
Right.
It gives them more room for empathy, which might feel a little unfair. But when you're spending all of your time trying to make ends meet, you don't have a lot of time and room to think about how the immigrant is feeling, or how the person who's trans and doesn't feel safe at home is feeling. You have more money and you have more time and you have more exposure. You can travel more. You can see the world more. You become more empathetic with those people. You start to worry about how your perception is internationally more. Like, I think there's a lot of nuance that would lead you to sort of democratic policies. And I mean, like, generally think that, and I'm biased, that those signs are positive for it's not sort of an indictment of Democrats that they're wealthy. I think it's a problem in that Democrats like to think of themselves as the party that wants to help people, including farmers and low-income people. They want Medicaid because they feel like people should have a right to health care, and that's a good way to do it. They want food subsidies and housing subsidies because they feel like people have a right to a house, and that's the way to do it. They want to think of themselves as helping people. Now, as the party becomes more wealthy, they become disconnected from what the actual needs of the people are. And so you get things like Democrats saying the economy is okay when it's not how people are feeling it. And the Democrats need to learn that lesson. And people like Bernie Sanders learned that lesson very well. He's been preaching this for a long time, that just because the economy numbers are good doesn't mean that citizens are financially healthy. There's a rather strong consensus, I think, among Democratic voters that a huge problem here is that as economic output has increased, wages have not increased to meet them. Most of the additional value that has been captured by shareholders, by investors, and by big institutional investments.
Right. It's not the guy on the line at the plant who's reaping all the benefits.
So how do you solve that? Potentially wealth taxes, potentially giving co-op ownership to workers. Like, I can't tell you what the right policy is, but I can tell you that is the problem in my perspective. America is the wealthiest nation in the world. We are objectively doing amazing economically as a country. You're not feeling that because that money is going to Donald Trump, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Mark Cuban, me. I'm an investor because I understand the power of equity. The people making 100 and 150K salaries, it's not going to them either.
No.
Unless they invest that money, right? And that's a problem. And it's a fundamental problem with our economic system. And it's a problem that is exacerbated by Trump's policies. It's a problem that is exacerbated by removing the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is meant to have some oversight to financiers and how they're like exploiting people. It's a problem that is exacerbated by closing ourselves off, isolating ourselves from the outside world so that we are investing in local manufacturing, which creates jobs, but it doesn't solve the problem of where the income from those jobs go.
I'm curious, what was the thing you said about as people get more time and grow in empathy, all that sort of stuff, that they like to think they're helping somebody or something to that effect? The thing that was really interesting to me in your comment was the idea of think they're helping.
Mm.
I think that's a really interesting idea, actually, because it's a different thing to say, I'm going to give my money to this government that I'm going to trust to then go do the work for me that I would like to see done, but I don't actually want to do. And it's just an interesting idea to me. Almost creating distance in a sense, it almost comes back around to still have created distance between yourself and the problem.
You're basically saying that they should step up and do the thing themselves, right?
Yeah.
But like
Come back to my ideal world.
to come back to your ideal world, sure. But I think we've sort of learned that idealism doesn't necessarily.
Yeah, no, right. Yeah, no, you have a good point, and that the unfortunate reality for my ideal world is that without a government that is taking from those people, most of them are not going to give to the things that I choose to give to. Right.
Yeah, I mean, everyone has limited time in their day, and most of it is spent with work at this point, and then you're left to spend the rest either how you want or another job. You may not have a lot of time left after you're done your 2 jobs and you're trying to survive.
But I was even talking about like giving financially.
Giving financially, yeah. I mean, the needs of people are taken care of by societal structures and not because they have to make an act of explicit intent to do that. Like, I think the Democrats writ large want to build a society that solves those problems systemically.
Which would be nice if we could trust systems to do good too.
Yeah, and I don't think the Democrat would say that you should trust a system. I mean, some would. Some people would say everything. I think that there's definitely some truth about not trusting the system.
Yeah, because a system is nothing if it has no people in it.
No, that is certainly true. I want to argue with that, especially as Donald Trump fires most of the federal workforce, which becomes nothing when there's no people in it.
I think that there is so much waste, right? And again, I'll be the first one to say that would be nice if that was what they're doing. I don't know, right? I don't trust all the things that they're saying that they're doing that are so good to help offset the deficit and all these cuts, right? I have no idea. You didn't let me look at it. It's difficult for me to be able to think that the government is going to do more good for people than I can do with my money and my time. But that's, when I hear, man, these are the people who would like to think they're trying to do good for people. It's difficult for me to hear that and not think, dude, just go do it. Call me. I'll give you 1,000,000 places you can go do good.
Well, I think what I meant more was that they like to think that they're voting for policies that do good for people. And I know it's a subtle difference, and your statement is still true, and I think that it's still valid. But the point that I wanted to make was more that Democrats want to find the policies that they feel like are helping
overtly
people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's a good clarification.
I do want to try one more angle. I think that a lot of Democratic thought, especially now, and I think it should align a lot with conservative thought if we can figure out the right phrasing, is I think that there's like an economic structure that we have built that is like modern American capitalism that has been working for a while, and it seems to not be working so well for the average person. Pretty clear to point to where all the economic growth has gone, because America has done objectively amazing in terms of GDP economic growth. It's all gone to the top, to 1%. That is not because of their merit. Like it or not, they're $400 billion, 400 billion times the net worth of like most people. He's not that good. No one's that good. The economic value has been created by Americans, by workers, by the people, by your friend who worked at SpaceX. He did great work. He was probably paid well. He probably wasn't paid as well as he should have been for the value that he created. And that's the bet. That's the bet that everyone is making, that their employees will create more value than they cost. And that's an okay bet. I mean, the person at the top is taking risk, he's taking big management expectations, he's like doing a lot. But I think it's gotten a little out of hand, and we're at the point where someone is doing a little bit of work, creating so much more value than they're receiving. It's going to the top, and the top are using that money to buy politicians, to fund challengers, Democratic challengers, so that they can stay in power. And that's a problem. Billionaires existing is even, I think, morally questionable to some people. That should anyone, while there are people starving, should anyone be accumulating that much wealth? Like, what are they really doing with that? Are they creating value in the world that is worth that?
See, and this is where I think a lot of the people that I know who are more like hardcore Republican hear this and they say yes. And most of that top 0.1% are Democrats. And what has changed?
Whether they're Democrats or not, and I'm not sure if that's true, but I'll go ahead and take your position. As a society, like this, I think we're allowing them to make it a Democrat versus Republican debate again, which is not
Well,
what it is.
no, I'm just making the point that in theory, if the Democratic Party
Mm.
is working this way and they have the people with the most influence at the top, then why is it still that it's all coming back to them? Right. Well, this begins to kind of breed a distrust.
I would start by having to challenge the premise. Are most of the top 0.1% Democrats? I don't know if that's true. I mean, you sort of gave me a statistic about $150,000 out.
Well, I mean, if you think of like we've got Elon, he's a Republican. He's probably up there.
He's the richest man in the world.
So, but then you think like Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, you would probably know more of the names to name than I do.
Everyone but Bill Gates is a Republican as far as current. All right, I don't know who they vote for.
I was going to say those guys all have made significant contributions to pretty liberal organizations.
Jeff Bezos, the Washington Post, he owns it. The Washington Post was going to endorse Kamala Harris. Jeff Bezos told them not to. Well documented, you can fact check me. He stopped the Washington Post from endorsing Kamala Harris. There was also a cartoonist who recently quit from the Washington Post because she made this cartoon of basically Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and all these people bowing down before a big fat Donald Trump. They wouldn't publish her cartoon and she quit. Jeff Bezos is currently using his influence to stop Democratic speech. Jeff Bezos was, along with Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Google, were seated directly behind Donald Trump at his inauguration. You haven't seen that picture? It's a good picture.
No, and maybe these guys were lying, right? But I watched a video. I can't remember who it was, but I watched a video that was going through the quote unquote top 10 list and was looking at funds that a bunch of these people from the top 10 Forbes list had given money to primarily liberal organizations, like more money than I have yet touched at this point in my young career, and it was like 8 out of 10.
I think it's fair to be skeptical. I could say for a fact that the things that I said were true. Now, whether Jeff Bezos has previously made more donations to the Democratic Party than he totally has to Republic, maybe he has. So I guess your question is, why aren't Democrats using that power to stop their influence? And because it's all corrupt, because money in politics is corrupt, and there will always be people who are corrupt in both parties.
Right.
Democratic voters, I think, are more keenly aware of the problem. I think most of us wish we had voted for Bernie Sanders instead of Joe Biden during the first primary, because Bernie Sanders has been the consistent, clear voice that the problem in American politics is money and that we have to stop it. I think the fact that Congress can invest while they can also make laws that affect the market is a clear conflict of interest. I think Democratic voters would be aligned on this. And unfortunately, there's so much money in politics that Democratic leaders are not saints.
Right.
We would not call them saints.
I think that a lot of people on the Republican side of the aisle look at this and say, we know that the system is flawed, and so why are we going to give it more fuel and give it more resources to be even more flawed?
Yeah, so it's a completely valid question. Throughout the arc of history has been about taking power from the few and giving it more and more to the many. So I made this point a little bit earlier, from tribes, to kings, to dukes, and from them to like to a Congress of representatives, to the people and democracy. One thing that I would say is that the way to handle this has got to be to find those forms of consolidated power and deconsolidate them. And what we're putting our finger on here is that one of those forms is money. And money is power, regardless of its influence on politics. But there are things we can start to do to address the problem. One of them is to limit the influence of money in politics by, well, for one, I would argue not electing billionaires who have multi-billionaires to be our main representatives and to be the main executor of because they're not going to make moves that limit their power unless they're saints. And I don't think either of us believe that Trump and Musk are saints. They're going to make moves that at the very best do nothing to solve that problem, but most likely entrench their power and make the problem worse. But we can start to address the problem of money in politics by making it the issue that we care about, instead of the issue being the price of eggs, which is a fair issue if you're struggling to feed your family. The fundamental issue is that you should have enough money to buy eggs because you should be paid more because you are bringing more value than you're receiving. So we should fix that, either by taxing the billionaires and then giving it back through subsidies or food stamps. That is kind of how we've been doing it, though we haven't been doing it that well, and we haven't been taxing them enough, and lots of things, by passing laws that prohibit monetary contributions to campaigns. This is the real problem of our age. This classist problem has been a problem forever, but currently money is exacerbating it. This is the real problem. And I think that this is probably a good place for us to just agree that we're mostly aligned. And I think this is true of most Democrats and Republicans, that if you can have this conversation, you can find out that the problem is class. It's always been class. It's always been people being exploited by the people at the top so that they can stay at the top. It's been that way since the beginning. That's the problem, not the Democrat or the Republican, whether or not we should let immigrants in or not. These are all nuanced problems that should be discussed. But the problem we're feeling right now is the problem that we have felt time and time again, that has led to revolution after revolution. The reason that America revolted from the king was unfair taxation and unfair representation and inequality in power. It's the problem, and we should unite against it.
I don't think this is a revolutionary claim, right? It shouldn't be, at least.
It's not, and I think we have to. So what worries me about the current political climate is that when we have these billionaires in power that are getting more power by ignoring Congress, by potentially ignoring the judiciary, and there's people supporting them because they're so angry, and they're using that support to justify ignoring checks and balances in the institution that we've created to try to prevent the consolidation of power, and we're just giving it to them. We're giving them more power. We're assenting to them having more power because we've become so frustrated. And you've given good reasons to be frustrated, but a solution to that frustration can't be to just bash through everything by giving all power to the billionaires. It will only exacerbate the problem. Long-term, medium-term, probably short-term.
It's an interesting time right now when you have a lot of people that almost, in some sense, almost ascribe to a sort of karma, right? Where it's like, oh, well, he earned it, so he can have it, regardless of what he chooses to do with it from there and how that affects everyone else. I agree with you that I think it's a very interesting and dangerous time right now. I think that there are a lot of things that people would agree, right? I think that trying to talk about what it is that people on the right want and that sort of thing, which we didn't touch on. It's an interesting time because I think that both sides are fundamentally missing each other in some of the key pieces of that equation that allows the rich to just keep getting richer while everybody else continues in their chaos, passing as ships in the night, who largely would agree on a lot of things.
From my perspective, they just want to live their lives the way that maybe their grandfathers lived their lives. They had a job, they did the work, now they can support a family, and they can live the lives they want to live. They want to be able to go to a doctor and get an answer without having to worry about the 50 hoops of insurance or how much something is going to cost or whether they can afford the insurance or not. And you can correct me if you're wrong. I don't want to explain to you what your side wants, but I think everyone wants that. And I think people in rural America, we should have talked about rural America more.
Which we can do. I'm happy to do another conversation specifically more about rural America. Right? We've been a little bit outside my wheelhouse here, delving into more.
Rural America might have been a better way to go.
Yeah, right. I'd be happy to talk to you more about rural
That'd
America.
be really interesting. Rural America is very interesting to me because I see in them the people who want to be left alone and they want a good life. And I feel very strongly that Trump's policies are taking advantage of it.
Programs that are out there to help those in need, a lot of times they're structured in a way that actually makes it much more difficult for a lot of rural America to reap the same benefits of the urban portion of America that's also impoverished.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting to talk about. I mean, it sounds like broadly, Democratic policies are too focused on urban areas, which makes sense because a lot of Democratic voters are urban and that's what they see and what they saw. But I think that broadly, like, Democratic voter policies would be good for rural America if implemented properly and with rural America's voice. Like, I think rural America on the side of Democratic voters, working with them and having their voices heard, could lead to great things. Because we could tax the billionaires and then use that money to actually give everyone health care and freedom of expression and freedom of speech and freedom of religion. I think there's a lot of problems that arise, but like in our current environment where economy appears to be the thing.
Yeah, I would love to have that conversation.
Sounds good. Let's have that conversation. Well, thanks for talking to me.
No, yeah, thank you so much for giving me the chance. It's I've really enjoyed getting to hear stuff from you. I have learned things and I appreciate it.
We'll talk about rural America next time.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Thank you for listening. If you have any comments or feedback, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me what worked and what didn't. If you disagreed with any takes here, I only ask that you be respectful in giving us that feedback. We're all just trying to do the best we can in this crazy world. Thank you. And until next time, remember that democracy is about the power of the people and not the few.